Grant stood beneath the amber lamps with one hand around his glass and the other resting near Celeste's waist, smiling like the room had already signed itself over to him. He was halfway through a polished line about integrity and second chances, his voice warm enough to make the donors nearest him nod before they swallowed. I stayed at the edge of the lakefront club with my clutch tucked against my ribs, watching the man who once handled every password in my life lift a champagne flute like trust had always belonged to him. Celeste tilted her head toward him with that dark satin composure she had perfected for expensive rooms, and Laurel watched from 2 steps back like the evening was landing exactly where she placed it. Then a male voice cut in from the side entrance, low and even, and said, "Mr. Quest. Hollis. We need a word outside regarding a federal identity theft and wire fraud matter." The music did not stop all at once, but it dipped hard enough for glass stems to pause mid-air, and that tiny break told me the room had felt it before anyone spoke. Grant did what he always did first, which was smile at trouble like it had misread the room, then angle his shoulders and answer, "I think you have the wrong time." The 2 men did not raise their voices, did not step closer than they needed to, and one of them repeated his name with the calm precision that makes polished people look suddenly unfinished. Beside him, Celeste's fingers closed tighter around her clutch, and that was the first honest movement I had seen from her all night. No one looked at me until Grant did, and when he found me across the room, something in his face shifted before he could smooth it back into shape. He had spent years making me sound confused, but standing there in his tailored tuxedo with federal words hanging over his glass, he looked like a man hearing his own language fail. I did not move toward him. I did not rescue him from the silence. And when the room stopped breathing around us, I finally understood how small his voice could sound without mine beneath it. Laurel's invitation arrived 3 weeks earlier on thick cream stock with my name centered in the same script she used for donor dinners, which was how I knew it was theater, not grace. Inside, one sentence did all the work. "We're all older now, and it would be gracious if you came." And I could hear her voice turning my presence into a prop before I even touched the RSVP card. I did not mistake it for forgiveness, because forgiveness does not come with a paper stock that expensive and wording that careful. When I stepped into the lakefront club that night, the room told me why I had been invited before anyone in the Hollis family crossed the floor to greet me. My place card waited at a side table near the service corridor, far from the windows, far from the family, far from the tight crescent of names arranged around Grant and Celeste, as if the future had already been professionally seated. A server glanced from my dress to the tablet in his hand and asked, "Guest or vendor?" And the fact that he had to ask told me Laurel had done exactly what she meant to do. She reached me a minute later in a silver dress that caught the amber light and smiled with the same controlled warmth she used when she wanted cruelty to sound like manners. Her fingers touched my elbow just long enough to claim the interaction, and then she looked past me toward the room and murmured, "Some evenings just ask everyone to understand where they fit," before drifting back toward the center she had built for her brother. I stood there with my clutch against my ribs, staring at my own name printed at the edge of the room. And once I saw that seat, once I heard the server ask if I belonged to staff, the invitation stopped pretending to be anything else. I had not been brought there to heal old history, and I had not been brought there to be welcomed back into anything. I had been placed where the room could read me before I spoke, where Grant's former wife could register as an afterimage while Celeste stood in the light, wearing the polished future they had arranged. By the time Grant lifted his glass and started talking about integrity, I already knew I was not in that room to be forgiven, only to be displayed. Grant had always handled complexity like it belonged to him, and early in our marriage, I mistook that confidence for care, because organized men are easy to confuse with honest ones. He kept the banking, the tax portal, the vendor accounts, the passwords, and every small digital gate that turns shared life into paperwork most wives never think to question. Whenever I paused over a form or asked why my signature was needed again, he would keep scrolling and murmur, "It's easier if I keep the moving parts together." The marriage did not break the day I understood he was sleeping with someone else, because betrayal had been living in the house long before desire changed address. It broke when my name began appearing inside records tied to businesses I had never entered, payments I had never approved, and income streams I had never touched. The first time I saw one of those filings years later, I felt the same physical drop I had felt at Laurel's table, that clean proof that a place had been arranged for me before I arrived. By then, I was working at the boutique compliance firm where Mason Reed reviewed transcripts the way other people studied weather, looking for patterns before they turned into damage. He set a printed file beside my keyboard one evening and tapped 3 lines with his pen. Then asked, "Did you ever receive consulting income through hospitality vendors?" I looked at the page, saw my own name attached to amounts that did not match any year of my real life, and answered, "I have never even met these people." Mason did not rush to soften it, which is how I knew the paper in front of me mattered more than any explanation Grant had ever given me. He turned another page, showed me an entity registration linked to my information, then a wage transcript carrying my name across activity I could not have explained under oath. I stared at the dates first, because dates are harder to gaslight than memories, and every one of them landed inside years when Grant still controlled every login I used. That was when the marriage changed shape for me, because infidelity humiliates you in private, but financial misuse follows you into systems that do not care how gently you were deceived. I could suddenly see the architecture of it, the way he had used domestic trust to keep me uninformed, then used my ignorance as cover once my name started carrying weight I never agreed to bear. Mason kept his voice level and said, "You need counsel before you contact anyone." And hearing that while my transcripts lay open between us told me this was no longer marital history. It was evidence. And evidence has a colder pulse than heartbreak because it does not bend for charm, apology, or the old instinct to explain a man into innocence. I took the folder home that night and spread it across my kitchen table, where the account numbers, filing years, and entity names made my apartment feel smaller than it had that morning. By the time I closed the last page, I knew our marriage had not ended when Grant stopped loving me, but when he learned my name could carry consequences for him better than his own. At first, I wanted to believe Celeste was only the newest lie, the glamorous ending Grant had chosen after years of making me smaller inside my own marriage. Then Mason slid 2 invoices beside my transcripts, both billed through her crisis communications practice. Both timed to the same months. My name was carrying vendor activity I could not explain. One line item read, "Reputation stabilization." Another read, "Stakeholder messaging." And seeing those words beside my filings told me she had not wandered into damage. She had priced it. The more records we pulled, the less she looked like a woman seduced by a polished man, and the more she looked like someone who recognized a working machine. She met Grant through a hospitality launch in West Loop. Saw the access, the donor rooms, the restaurant circles, the expensive trust around him, and understood immediately where the weak seam lived. He knew how to bury risk inside paperwork, and she knew how to flood a room with language that made the buried risk sound like maturity. After that, I began hearing her in places where she was not physically present, which was how I knew her work had spread farther than the affair itself. Phrases started repeating with the same lacquered rhythm, that Grant had carried the financial burden alone, that I never understood long-term planning, that some women confuse emotion with responsibility. Those lines did not come from heartbreak, because heartbreak is messy and repetitive, but from a professional mouth that knew exactly how to give a selfish man cleaner words. The final piece was an email chain tied to a launch budget, where Celeste tightened wording around guest optics, while Laurel discussed who should be visible and who should remain peripheral. I read that thread after staring at her retainer invoice, and once those 2 documents touched each other in my mind, the whole arrangement stopped pretending to be romantic. Celeste had not stolen a man from me, because stolen men still require impulse and secrecy, and what she entered with Grant was already a system, polished, profitable, and waiting for a second operator. Ava Sinclair came in after Mason had already lined the paper trail across my kitchen table. And the first thing she did was remove any illusion that pain alone could carry me anywhere. She read the transcripts, the entity records, the invoices, the old portal notices, then rested one hand on the folder and said, "We do not tell a story first." What she meant became clear when she opened a yellow legal pad and started building a chronology from the dates already printed in front of us. We began with the wage and income transcripts because they were harder to charm than memory, and each year carried my name across activity that never belonged to my real life. Then came the entity filings, the vendor payments, the consulting descriptions, the registration records, and the exact stretches of time when Grant still controlled every login and signature workflow inside our marriage. By the time Ava drew a line from one tax year to the next, what had felt like scattered humiliation started looking like a system with timing, structure, and purpose. She made me separate what I knew from what I could prove. And that discipline was harder than grief, because grief had always let me collapse into one blurred feeling. Proof had to be cleaner than that, so every page was marked, cross-referenced, and clipped to the next page that explained why it mattered inside the sequence. We were not building outrage across my table. We were building something that could leave my apartment, survive scrutiny, and return carrying my name without shame. That meant laying my real employment history beside the reported income, because the mismatch itself did more work than any accusation I could have spoken into a phone. It meant setting Celeste's retainer invoices next to the same months my records showed vendor activity, then placing Laurel's guest optics email beside both, so motive stopped hiding behind tone. Once those documents touched each other, the affair no longer looked like private betrayal, because the money, the language, and the social staging were all moving in the same direction. Ava also made me map the divorce dates, the address changes, the banking cutoffs, and the periods after separation when my name still carried consequences I had not authorized. That was the point where fear changed shape for me, because every date after I was gone made it harder to tell myself this had been confusion inside a collapsing marriage. The records kept moving long after I had moved out, and that persistence told me Grant had not made one bad choice. He had preserved a mechanism. We filed quietly, exactly as Ava instructed, without warning Grant, without calling Celeste, and without giving Laurel one dramatic sentence she could turn into proof that I was unstable. For the first time since my marriage had ended, I stopped trying to sound believable and started trying to be exact. Because exactness travels farther inside the American system than wounded dignity ever does. By the night I walked into that lakefront club and saw where Laurel had seated me, I was no longer carrying a private hurt into a public room. I was carrying a map. Ava texted me 40 minutes before the engagement dinner began. "Keep your phone on." And that was all, which made it easier to breathe because certainty would have felt theatrical. I parked along the lake, checked my reflection once without fixing anything, and walked toward the club knowing I was no longer entering as the woman they had already summarized for each other. By then, the records had done what explanations never could, and the map in my mind was steadier than the pulse I felt in my throat. Inside, the room looked exactly like money, trying not to seem impressed with itself. All amber lamps, low florals, lacquered wood, and quiet voices trained for private clubs. Grant moved through that glow like he had built it personally. One hand on a shoulder here, one easy laugh there, accepting congratulations with the calm entitlement of a man standing inside his own mythology. Celeste matched the room as cleanly as the place cards matched the table linen, and seeing her beside him under that light made Laurel's guest optics email feel less abstract. No one rushed to me, which was fine, because I had not come back to this room to test whether kindness had finally found me. A server offered champagne. Another collected wraps near the entrance. And the whole club kept sorting faces by value, while my seat remained exactly where Laurel had intended it to remain. That placement mattered more than any greeting would have, because once a room tells you where it thinks you belong, Every smile afterward becomes decorative rather than informative. I stayed near the edge and let them have their choreography, because interruption would have helped Grant more than it helped me. And I had not come there to rescue his timing. He touched the stem of his glass, waited for the room to gather around his voice, and began speaking about second chances, earned honestly, as if language itself had never once been misused in his hands. Standing there with Laurel's seating choice behind me, Celeste's polished stillness ahead of me, and Ava's message still warm in my phone, I knew I had returned to their room without asking it to make space for me. Grant barely reached the middle of second chances earned honestly before the side door opened, and two men stepped into the room with the kind of calm that does not ask to be noticed. They did not hurry, did not look around like guests, and that restraint changed the air faster than any raised voice could have managed. One stopped within speaking distance of Grant's lifted glass and said, "Mr. Hollis, we need a word outside regarding a federal identity theft and wire fraud matter." For one suspended second, Grant smiled as if the sentence had landed on the wrong tuxedo, and I watched him reach for charm the way other men reach for balance. He lowered his glass just enough to look gracious and answered, "I think you have the wrong time." But the man nearest him repeated his name with the same even tone and did not step back. Celeste's posture held for half a beat too long. Then her fingers tightened around her clutch hard enough to pull the satin smooth across her knuckles. Laurel moved before anyone else in the family did, not toward her brother, but toward the event manager with her face gone pale and her voice flattened into urgency. I could not hear every word from where I stood, but I heard press and upstairs clearly enough, and that told me exactly what she was trying to save first. Around them, the room stayed seated but stopped pretending, glasses hovering near mouths, shoulders shifting toward Grant, donors suddenly listening with the same concentration they used for numbers. Grant tried one more register, the expensive one, and said, "If this concerns paperwork, you can speak to counsel tomorrow." Like scheduling could restore hierarchy once those words were already loose in the room. The second man stepped half a pace closer and answered, "We are asking you to come with us now." And that was when Grant finally looked across the tables and found me standing where Laurel had placed me. He did not look angry first, or wounded, or even confused, because what crossed his face before anything else was recognition. I did not move toward him, because distance was doing more for me than any speech could have done, and because every eye in that club could now measure him without my help. He kept looking at me as if the old version of me might still appear and rescue him by softening what this moment meant. But there was nothing left in me that wanted to do that work. I let the silence finish its job, then said, "You should go with them now." And by the time he set his glass down and turned toward the side door, he already knew nobody in that room could save him from what had reached him. When the door closed behind Grant, the room did not become mine, and I did not need it to, because the only thing I had come back for was my name. Celeste stayed frozen beside the place he had left. Laurel kept whispering into damage control. And somewhere beyond that club, Ava was already moving my records toward daylight. I walked out before anyone could offer me pity, and the cold lake air hit my face clean enough to make me realize I was not shaking anymore. For years, my name had been the place other people stored risk, confusion, and shame, but that night it felt separate from them again. Mason had found the pattern. Ava had given it shape. And Grant had heard the end of his own version while standing inside the life he built from it. I did not win the room. I won the right to leave it without carrying what he had put on me. If this story stayed with you, thank you for being here with me through it. If you have ever rebuilt your life quietly and found peace later than you wanted, tell me below. And if you finally found gentle love after surviving something hard, I hope it keeps choosing you back.